Boldwood presents Excalibur, written by Peter Gibbons and read by Sean Barrett. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Now, when his youthful strength had increased, and a noble desire for command burned in his young breast, he remembered the valiant deeds of heroes of old, and as though awakening from sleep, he changed his disposition, and gathering bands of followers, took up arms. When he had devastated the towns and residences of his foes, their villages and fortresses with fire and sword, and gathered together companions from various races and from all directions, he amassed great booty. From the Vita Sancti Guthlaki, written by the East Anglian priest Felix in the early 8th century. The great 6th century kingdoms of Britain. After the collapse of the Roman Empire in 400 AD, the legions left Britain to descend into a place of constant, brutal warfare. By the 6th century, the island is ruled by fierce kings from behind crumbling Roman strongholds and menacing hilltop fortresses. The southeast and western kingdoms have fallen to marauding Germanic invaders known as Saxons. The Saxons are a warlike people from across the sea, first invited to Britain by Vortigern, a weak king of a small kingdom, to aid him in his wars against the rival kings of Britain. Frayed, located close to Cumbria in modern-day England, ruled by King Urien from his seat at the Bear Fort. Warriors of Frayed carry their bear sigil upon their shields. Gododin, a kingdom in Britain's northeast, close to modern-day Northumberland and East Lothian, ruled by King Leton Luedoc from his fortress Dupendirlo. Gododin's warriors march under a stag banner. Dalrieta, kingdom on Scotland's west coast, covering what is now Argyll. Dumnonia, ruled by King Uther Pendragon. Dumnonian warriors march to war with a dragon sigil upon their shields. Located in Britain's southwest, mainly in modern-day Devon, Somerset, and Cornwall. Gwynedd, ruled by King Cadwallon Longhand, located in North Wales and Anglesey. Elmet, ruled by King Gwalog, located in the area around modern-day Leeds, reaching down south to the Midlands. Elmet's warriors wear the Lorica segmentata armour and red cloaks of the Roman legions. Bernicia, lands lost to Ida, the Saxon conqueror, covers what is now South Northumberland, Tyne and Wear, and Durham. Its warriors once fought beneath the proud banner of the fox. Deira, lands stretching along much of Britain's west coast, which fell to Saxon invaders in Vortigern's Great War. Lothian, ruled by King Lot, encompassing what is now southeast Scotland. Powys, ruled by King Brochvael the Fanged, a large and powerful kingdom in what is now central Wales. Pictland, lands occupied by the Picts in Scotland's north. Bernicia, lands in the southwest of what is now Wales, ruled by King Morholt and his Irish warriors who took the kingdom by force. Gwent, a kingdom between the rivers Wye and Usk in what is now South Wales, ruled by King Teodrig. Chapter 1. 540 AD, Britain. A blood-coloured sun crept above jagged treetops as 3 mounted warriors and 20 spearmen left the Bear Fort on a frosty spring morning. Long shadows crept through grasping boughs to dapple the land in dark shapes, and a shallow mist lingered on the forest floor. A wild storm had thrashed the stronghold for a day and a night, howling across its spiked walls to soak through men's cloaks, breastplates, and tunics, so the warriors marched in grim ranks with damp clothes clinging to their skin like shrouds. Hooves and boots crunched through the undergrowth, leather belts, bridles, and armour creaked, and the men grumbled about the early start as they marched with ash-shafted spears resting on their shoulders and breath billowing from their mouths in great clouds to mist the chill air. The next man I hear complaining gets a thick ear, barked Hector, his voice gruff and as menacing as the snarling bear painted upon his shield. He was their comitatus, as the Rome folk would have it, the leader of the war band, and King Urien of Reged's champion. Hector was fearsome, a huge man with hands like shovels. He wore a coat of shining chainmail and carried a long sword in a fleece-lined scabbard strapped to his thick leather belt. Hector's face was broad and as hard as mountain rock. His forehead jutted like a cliff, and his chin was wide and strong. Scars ran across his broken nose and cheeks, and he was as fearsome to look upon as a winter storm. His forearms were so thick with death rings that they tattooed his entire arms dark blue. When a warrior killed an enemy in battle, he tattooed a ring around his forearm in memory of the slain man's warrior spirit, and Hector had run out of room upon his arms many years ago. Arthur shifted on his horse and lifted his spear for a moment to ease its weight on his shoulder. He rode because he was Hector's foster son, and the marching spearmen cast resentful glances at him, their judgment burning Arthur like a whip. This was Arthur's second march with Hector's war band. The first had come 2 weeks earlier, when the war band had marched south to collect overdue render from farms on the southern edge of Urien's realm. Each hide or farm in Reged owed Urien 1/10 of their farm's surplus. If the render was not delivered, the war band would go to collect it, and Hector's visit was never gentle. "We might get to fight this time," said Kay, Hector's son, Arthur's foster brother and friend. He leaned over so that Hector would not hear, and grinned at Arthur. Kay and Arthur had both seen 17 summers, but Kay was both taller and wider across the shoulders. He had hair the colour of a rusted blade and green eyes like his father. Kay had his father's face, but it was as yet unmarked by battle, and his beard was as sparse and wispy as Arthur's. "I will earn my first death ring today." "Hopefully," Arthur lied, forcing himself to smile. Arthur and Kay had trained with weapons since the time they could walk. Hector and his brutal captain, Hywel, taught them the thrusts of the spear, the cuts of the sword, knife-fighting, the bow, and the war-axe. Arthur could fight, and he loved the sword, but he had never killed a man. "Pick up the pace there, bastard!" Hywel growled on Arthur's flank. He glanced down at the stocky warrior, whose scarred face was as wrinkled and hard as a boar's back. The grizzled warrior snarled at him and spat into the undergrowth. Arthur rode whilst Hywel marched, and the veteran of countless battles hated Arthur for that. Hywel hated that Arthur slept beneath warm furs in Hector's household. He hated that Arthur was an orphan who shared Kay's privileges. Arthur's legs hung loose at the horse's belly, so he dug his heels in and clicked his tongue to pick up the roan mare's pace. They followed a mud-slick path through the thick forest. Wagon wheel ruts ran deep to either side, and the tracks stank of horse shit and wet earth. Arthur's mare kicked up clods of mud, and he stifled a laugh as Hywel cursed behind him. Blackbirds sang in the boughs, and a robin trilled somewhere in the canopy of green and brown. Fresh leaves filled branches, and the sunlight punched through them in shafts of light to create shifting shadows in the mist. The forest smelled of the storm, damp and heavy like a wet dog. Bluebells and wildflowers spattered the sides of the path with a wash of cover. By late afternoon, the war band rested on a high crag, a jutting cliff with a view into a sprawling valley where woodland gave way to fields separated by ditch and hedge. Farmers were busy finishing sowing their furrows, bringing animals to green pastures after long winters, and shearing their sheep for wool. "Bastards are down there somewhere," said Hector, glaring down into the valley. A river cut through the lowland, meandering and glistening like a blue snake. Thatched farmsteads shone like gold amongst the fields, and Arthur looked across the valley with his keen hazel eyes, but could see no sign of an enemy. "There's no smoke," said Hywel, spitting as he so often did through his missing front teeth. "Wherever there are raiders,
There's smoke."
"They're probably sleeping off a long night enjoying stolen ale and beef," said Kay, and Hector grunted without taking his eyes off the shining river. "A farmer in the fields said they were at the old villa. We'll be there before nightfall."
"If they are still there," said Hector, "they'll know we are coming. All men know that to raid Reged means death. Urien suffers no attacks on his land. Even the Bucellari know that. If they have any cunning in their masterless skulls, they will be long gone by now."
"If they had the cunning of a turnip, they'd not have raided Reged. Any Bucellari this far north have come from Bernicia or Deira. Bucellari bands of masterless men, fighting for any lord who can pay them, must have come from beyond that frontier. Maybe they've grown tired of fighting the Saxons in the east and fancy themselves some easier prey."
"Bastards picked the wrong prey this time," said Hector. He rested his hand on his sword's leather-wrapped hilt. "We march to the villa and kill any man we find there." He turned, and the heat of his gaze fell upon Arthur and Kay. "You are men now, full-grown and ready to fight. Your place is with the warband, so today you'll fight and kill. You know how. This is what we do. We serve King Urien, fight his wars and kill his enemies. We collect the render owed to him, and he provides us with land, men, silver, and glory. If you can't fight, you can't stay in my service, son or not. So kill and soak your blades with blood, so the men can see it. Earn their respect. I gave you both spears and knives and horses to ride, so earn them too." "Your father and I started with nothing. Everything we have we won by the blade," Hewell snarled, and he slapped his sword hilt for extra emphasis. "The first time I fought, I carried a rusty dagger. I killed 2 men that day, and have been a warrior ever since. Don't let me catch you, shirking bastard. You'll fight today, or I'll drive you out of Reged myself." "Enough. They know their duty. Let's march." Arthur swallowed hard and glanced up at his spear's sharp point. Father Edaug had told him it was not a sin to kill an enemy. To kill an innocent man was murder, and God looks kindly on those who uphold the king's peace. Arthur worried about that. Father Edaug was a pious man and Hector's priest. He lived on Hector's estate and ate his food, and saw to the souls of Hector's men and their families. Arthur had prayed and asked God, and the old gods, for aid many times. Countless nights he had prayed to know who his mother and father were, and why they had abandoned him, but God never answered his prayers. "If I have to hear one more story about Hewell and my father fighting for King Uther in the Great War, I'll gouge my eyes out," said Kay, once the 2 old warriors had left to join the men. "Do you think you can do it?" asked Arthur. "Do what? Gouge my eyes out?" "No, kill a man." Kay shrugged. "We have no choice. That's our life now. Besides, these are wicked men. Bucellari are mercenaries without honour. You heard the farmer in Urien's hall. These men have killed women and children and razed farms to the ground. They deserve to die." Arthur nodded and followed his friend back to their mounts. Fear curdled his belly, and Arthur did not share the meal of oatcakes and ale. All the men in Hector's war band were hard men, killers and professional warriors. Hector himself was the champion of Reged. Many said he was the greatest warrior in all of Britain. Hector never lost, not even on the practice ground. Kay had come close the last winter, almost landing a strike with a wooden sword, but Hector had recovered and thundered a fist into Kay's belly to win the bite. It was time to become a man, and Arthur hoped he was brave enough. Kay could do it. He was fearless and a fine warrior with every weapon. He beat Arthur in most practice bouts, and Arthur himself was skilled with sword and spear. In his heart, Arthur was not a violent man. He liked to listen to the bards and their stories, to dream of heroes and legends, and of the Rome folk and their mighty empire. He enjoyed weapons, especially the sword,
and the physicality of the practice yard. Every lesson Ector and Hywel had taught told Arthur that to kill was his purpose in life. He would be a warrior and protect Riged from her enemies. But to rip a man's life away, to pierce his flesh with cold iron and send him screaming to the afterlife, that was different to hitting Kay with a wooden sword or a spear. The war band reached the villa as the sun set behind them, washing the land with a dim light the color of gold. Their spears cast long shadows like the claws of a monster upon lush green grass as 23 warriors crouched behind a gorse thicket. They peered at the ruins of a sprawling villa, its white stone walls crumbled, and red tiles which once covered its sloping roof littered the ground. The villa was another remnant of the mighty Romans who had ruled Britain for hundreds of years, and then left in the time of Ector's great-grandsire to leave the land littered with memories of their greatness and riven with violent anarchy without law or legion. "How many?" asked Ector. He crouched with his sword drawn. Its steel edge gleamed, and its blade caught the twilight to reveal the strange smoke in its metal. It was a magnificent weapon given to Ector by Uther Pendragon for his services in the Great War against Vortigern and the marauding Saxons. Arthur could not take his eyes off the sword. He hoped to own such a weapon one day, the weapon of a champion. Arthur carried a spear and a long knife, and he would continue to do so until he killed a man and gained better weapons, or his lord rewarded him with them. 30 men, Hywel said, his flint-hard eyes squinting at the men lolling in the villa's courtyard. They had made a fire from rotting roof beams and lolled about it, laughing and drinking ale from clay jugs. They were rough men, bushy-bearded, with dark eyes and darker laughs. 3 women mewed and wept as the Bugolari mercenaries passed them around the fire. The women, stripped naked, had terror-stricken faces drawn long by fear and suffering. A nest of spears and shields were neatly piled in a corner, while 6 tied horses stood beside the rubble of a fallen-down barn. The Bugolari wore wool tunics and dark cloaks. A handful wore leather breastplates, and none wore the heavy chain-mail coats which separated the lords of war from the rest of the warrior caste. Ector and Hywel each wore a heavy mail coat made from tiny interlocked rings of iron which protected them from neck to groin. "We'll do them now, whilst they're drunk," said Ector, and Hywel grinned wolfishly. "A rider!" hissed a spearman. Arthur turned, spear lowered. He licked at dry lips, thoughts flashing through his head. What if it was enemy riders? Perhaps the enemy had surrounded them. A figure approached from the tree line beyond a wild meadow, the same direction from which Arthur and the warband had marched moments earlier. "Bloody fool girl!" Ector cursed, but Arthur smiled, because the figure was not the enemy. It was Luneta, Kay's younger sister. She came with a bow slung over her shoulder and a quiver of arrows at her belt. Her dark hair fell about her slim shoulders, and she raised her chin in defiance as Ector and Hywel waved frantically at her to duck down before the Bugolari mercenaries saw her. "I warned you, girl," Ector said through gritted teeth, as Luneta crouched between Arthur and Kay. "I'll marry you off the moment we get home. You're going to get yourself killed." "I can't let you two have all the fun whilst I spin yarn and listen to the wives talk of weaving and babies," said Luneta. She ignored her father, blue eyes prideful and her raven-black hair shining. Luneta unslung her bow and tested the string, and Arthur laughed at her brave impudence. She was Ector's favourite, the apple of his eye, and he doted on her wild savagery. Luneta's upbringing should have focused on spinning yarn, weaving clothes and tapestries, and becoming a good wife. But she was wilder than either Kay or Arthur, and Ector indulged her, training her to fight with bow and spear, and allowing her to ride and live with his men. "Don't get in the way, pig-nose," Kay whispered, and Luneta punched him on the arm. She hated that name, earned because of her snub nose, and Arthur laughed again at the fond rivalry between brother and sister.
It masked his fear momentarily. But Hywel readied the men, and the gnawing heat in Arthur's belly returned. "Strike fast. Don't hesitate," Luneta whispered, fixing him with her bright eyes. He nodded and swallowed the lump in his throat. Hector stood and raised his sword to the heavens. "For God and Reged!" he roared, and strode from the gorse like the champion he was. Orange light from the enemy's fire caught the links of his mail and the patterns of his sword blade, and the enemy leapt from the fallen masonry. Men dashed for spears and shields, and Hector broke into a charge, flanked by Hywel and his 20 loyal spearmen. Each warrior in Hector's warband was oath-sworn to fight and die for him, and he led from the centre, brave and unflinching. The warriors charged like a flock of birds, Hector at the tip of the wedge, every man howling his war cry. Guy ran with them, spear lowered, his boyish face twisted in anger. All Hector's men carried spears in their fists and long knives at their belts. Some were lucky enough to carry shields, but only Hector and Hywel had swords. "Go, Arthur!" Luneta shouted, kicking Arthur in the leg. Fear rooted him to the spot like a tree, unable to move or breathe. "You can do it! Go!" Arthur clenched his teeth and gripped the smooth ash of his spear. He surged to his feet, held his breath, and ran. His heart thundered in his chest like a war drum as he followed 10 paces behind Hector, spear lowered, the sound of men shouting and horses' whickering churning in his ears. The enemy panicked, desperately readying weapons to fight off the men who came screaming from the fields like demons. Hector killed the first man with the sweep of his sword, and blood flew bright in the fading light as death came for the brigands who had raided King Urien's lands. An arrow whipped past Arthur's head and slammed into a Busselari warrior's chest, and Arthur glanced over his shoulder to where Luneta knocked another arrow to her bowstring. He turned back, and his spear shifted off balance. The butt caught his trailing leg, and Arthur sprawled on the grass. He cursed and scrambled to his feet, but a short man with a furious face swung an axe at Arthur's head, and he thought he must die. But an arrow struck the enemy in the thigh, and he sank to the earth in pain. Arthur twisted around the fallen man and kept on running. The fight raged around him, and Hywel drove his spear into a big man's throat and twisted the blade with a mighty roar. A Busselari disemboweled a ragged man with a long knife. Arthur knew him and gasped at the terrible wound. The iron stink of blood and the stench of shit as dying men voided their bowels filled the air, and Arthur ran. He reached the villa's crumbling walls and realized he was running to nowhere, caught up by fear and closeness to death. Hywel dragged his spear free of a dying man and roared his war fury as he threw the spear to take another enemy in the chest. Hywel spat and dragged his sword free of its fleece-lined scabbard. He parried an enemy's spear and slashed open that man's throat with a vicious backswing. Hot blood spattered Arthur's face as he ran past Hywel, and he gasped at the feel of another man's lifeblood upon his skin. "This is what you were trained to do, so do it. Fight!" Arthur tried to convince himself, but his feet would not move, as though fixed to the earth by a druid spell. Guy drove his spear into the belly of a young warrior, yanked the point free, and stabbed again to make his first kill. Arthur's mouth was dry, his tongue like old leather. He could feel eyes upon him, judging him, could imagine Hywel's cruel rebukes if he failed to strike a blow in the fight. "I should have killed the axeman." Luneta had saved his life, and all Arthur had to do was kill the wounded man, and the deed would be done. He would be a warrior. But he had just run away like a dog without sense or courage. A huge enemy with a thick black beard and wild curly hair burst from the ruins, holding a war-axe in one hand and a shield in the other. He barged Hywel out of the way with his shield, roared in defiance, and cracked the edge of his axe into a ragged warrior's skull with a sickening crack. The bearded enemy yanked the axe free in a wash of dark blood and grey slime, and grinned as his eyes rested on Arthur. He came at Arthur, his maw full of stubby brown teeth, and his beard a mess of tangled hair, lice, and filth. He swung his axe and bellowed with hate, and Arthur ducked beneath the wild swing. The shield came about and crashed into Arthur's shoulder, driving him backwards. Arthur stumbled under the impact, and the axe came around in a blur. He raised his spear just in time to parry the blow. The big man kicked Arthur savagely in the groin, and as he doubled over, a knee thundered into his face. Arthur fell to the ground and scrambled over the dew-soaked grass. He was winded, gasping for air, and had dropped his spear. Panic flooded his senses as he tried to drag his knife free of the sheath at his belt. He closed his eyes tightly, expecting the axe to fall and chop into his skull, neck, or back. "Fight me, dog!" barked a familiar voice. Arthur sucked in a chest full of air and rolled onto his back. Hector had come, and the big Busselari left Arthur to face King Urien's champion. The two men circled each other, like great wolves eyeing the other's size and battle scars. Arthur scrambled to his knees, and then stood, bracing himself against the rough edge of a broken-down wall. He found his spear in the grass, and humiliation washed over him. To drop a weapon in battle was shameful, and Arthur looked around, hoping that nobody had seen him fall before the enemy warrior, and found Hewell's cruel eyes boring into him, a smirk playing at the corner of his hard mouth. The battle was over, and 6 enemy warriors knelt in submission. Only the bearded man remained. More writhed on the blood-soaked ground in miserable pain, whilst others lay dead amongst the ruins. Hector's warband gathered about to watch their leader fight the fiercest of the enemy, and the big man spat at them, shaking his axe and daring Hector to come and die. Hector dropped his shield and drew his long knife in his left hand, his sword blade soaked with dead men's blood and held firm in his right. Arthur stared at Hector, wondering how he could be so brave and so fearsome. The warband stared at Hector like he was a hero of old, one of the giants who had lived in Britain before the Rome folk came. Their eyes blazed with pride. Hector's hard, flat face was implacable as he advanced on the large Bucalari mercenary. The fire crackled and spat, and its light danced on the plains of Hector's face. He came forward, sword held in an aggressive stance, and his knife held low. The sword lashed out, snake-fast, and the enemy warrior darted away from its fight and swung his axe at Hector's midriff, but the knife blocked the strike with a great clang of iron as the two weapons came together. Hector stepped in and head-butted the enemy warrior savagely in the nose, and then again. He sliced his sword along the bigger man's sword arm, and the bushy-bearded enemy dropped his shield and staggered backwards. His face was a mask of blood around his ruined nose, and Hector stepped back and drove the point of his sword into the Bucalari's chest. The enemy tottered, staring down with horror at the blade in his chest, and Hector dropped his knife, gripped the sword hilt with 2 hands, and ripped the blade downwards so that it tore the enemy open like a hunted deer, disemboweling him with fearsome strength. The big man fell to his knees, and the blue-red horror of his inside slopped out, steaming onto the grass. The warband cheered, and Hector cleaned his blade on the dead man's filthy cloak. "Kill the rest of them, all but one, and mount their heads on the ends of their spears as a warning to any other raiders who come this way," Hector ordered, and Hewell saw it was done. All the Bucalari died, save one sullen warrior, whom Hewell tied to a post to wait for Hector's questioning. "Arthur, are you hurt?" Hector came close and draped a heavy arm about Arthur's shoulders. He could not meet his foster-father's eyes, and stared instead at the ground. "No, Spearfather," he said, using the name he had used for Hector since he was a small boy. It was not right to call the man his father, for he was not, and Spearfather had always seemed more appropriate. "You must learn to be more ruthless, my boy. Kay made his first kill. Congratulate him." Hector placed a thick finger beneath Arthur's chin and raised his head so he could peer into Arthur's eyes. "Your time will come, lad. There is a warrior inside of you. I can see it. Believe in yourself and master your fear." "But I was afraid. A man can't be brave if he isn't afraid. What is bravery but the overcoming of fear? I was afraid today, and so was every man here." "You were afraid?" "Of course. All men fear death. You must accept it, lad. Pretending to be brave and acting in the face of danger is still bravery." Hector smiled and clapped Arthur heavily on the shoulder, and then left to join his men. Arthur sighed. The warriors gathered about Kay, and Arthur's friend and foster-brother basked in their acclaim. He recreated his spear thrust, and the warriors cheered him. Hywel grabbed Kay's forearm in the warrior's grip, and Arthur thought that was the thing he wanted most in the world, to be respected by Hywel, to be offered the warrior's grip from so great a warrior. Hector went to his son, and raised his arm in triumph. He stripped the weapons from the man Kay had killed and handed them to his son, along with the conical helmet the dead man wore. Finally, Hector placed his hand on the dead man's wound, stood, and wiped the blood down Kay's face. The men of the war band bowed their heads, and then roared their acclaim for the newly blooded member of their brotherhood of warriors. "I killed 2 men today," said Luneta. Her lithe limbs bounded over rubble, and she stood beside Arthur, watching Kay's glorious moment. "Nobody bloods my face." "Your father is angry with you," said Arthur. "You shouldn't have come." "If I hadn't, you'd be dead." She crossed her arms and raised her eyebrow. Luneta had none of her father's harsh features and all of her mother's beauty, or so the women of Hector's hall said. Her mother had died when Luneta was a girl, and so she had grown up amongst the warriors. "I would have killed that axeman if you hadn't hit him with your arrow." "No, you wouldn't." She stood teary-eyed with her lip quivering. "A thank you would be nice. You were a horrible boy, Arthur." She stormed off. Arthur wanted to go after her, to thank her for saving his life, but he just slumped against the ruined villa and pondered his failings. Chapter 2. The war band spent the night at the ruined Roman villa. The warriors kept the raiders' fire blazing in the courtyard and sat around it, drinking stolen ale and eating stolen meat. Arthur sat alone inside the crumbling walls, wanting to join in as the men became drunk and congratulated Kay for his skill and told old war stories. Hywel took a bone needle and made the death ring on Kay's right forearm. He made myriad pricks with a needle the war band used to stitch wounds, and smeared the bloody ring with a mix of soot from the fire and crushed plants mixed into a dark paste. Arthur's shame kept him away, and he sat in the darkness on a floor of tiny square stones, which had once made a fine floor picture, but were now as scattered and random as beach shale. The men told tales of the Great War, of how the kings of Britain had united to fight Vortigern, the usurper of Deira, and the army of Saxon warriors he brought across the sea. They cheered the tale of how Hector and Ambrosius Aurelianus had fought and killed many Saxons in a great battle on the country's wild east coast. They told of Excalibur, the sword of Britain, which Ambrosius wielded to slay Saxons by the hundreds. The roof was intact in its corners, and so the corner beams and surviving red tails kept any rain off Arthur during the night. He wondered at the skill and craftsmanship that the Romans used to make such buildings, which had crumbled and decayed across Britain. Men said that the Romans could heat the floors of their buildings, and that those floors were more beautiful than the finest tapestries. Arthur could imagine it as he toyed with the tiny square pieces, which felt like shards of a broken jug, each one painted with bright colours, which had become stained and pitted by time. The skill to make such things had left with the legions, and now men built in timber, thatch, and wattle, which rotted and stank and needed constant repair. Arthur tried to block out the war stories, and wondered what else the Rome folk knew, what secrets they had of history, law, war, and healing that were lost to Arthur's people. Arthur lay down beneath his cloak and closed his eyes, unable to shake off the memories of the day's fight and how he had missed his chance to become a warrior. Luneta lay down beside him silently.
and he felt her big blue eyes staring at him in the darkness, but could find nothing to say to her. Even she had fought well, using her bow with devastating effectiveness. Perhaps it is I who should spin yarn, and she who should do the fighting. Eventually he drifted off into a fitful sleep, only to be woken by a big hand shaking his shoulder. "Wake up, lad," said Hector, his hard face peering at Arthur through the gloom. "Follow me." Hector held out his calloused paw and helped Arthur rise. He followed the scarred warrior out into the courtyard, which was deserted, but the fire still blazed and warmed the sleep from Arthur's eyes. "It's my watch, so I thought we could talk a while." "Yes, Spearfather," Arthur said. Hector took a spit from the fire and offered Arthur a chunk of roast beef, which he took hungrily, blowing at the meat and his burning fingers before popping the juicy chunk into his mouth. "We might as well eat. The beast is dead. It's no good to the farmer now." "Where did the raiders come from?" "From the borders of Bernicia, just as we thought. They fought for landowners there against the Saxons until the enemy became too many and the fighting too hard. So they thought they'd come to Rigade for easier pickings." "And now they'll never leave." Arthur glanced around the villa at the spears Hewell and the warriors had sunk into the ground, with grisly heads spiked on their points. Firelight flickered on the dried blood and greasy hair of the severed heads, and Arthur looked away, the meat in his mouth suddenly losing its luster. "And now they'll never leave," Hector agreed. "They raped those 3 women mercilessly and killed their families. They cut a swathe of death and suffering across our lands, and it's our job to protect our people from wicked men." "Why does God not protect them?" Hector laughed. "That's a question for Father Idaug when we get home, or a question for the old gods. But these are Urian's lands, and we are his warriors. The people look to us for protection, Arthur, so we must be every bit as brutal and savage as the men we face." "I let you down today." Arthur looked away from his foster father and the severed heads and into the campfire, searching there for a reason why he couldn't live up to Hector's expectations, but found no answers in the red glow. "I'm as proud of you today as I was yesterday, lad. Never doubt that. You'll be a great man some day. You are clever and brave. God only knows what goes on inside that thought cage of yours, but it's in your blood. You just need to trust in yourself, boy." "What blood? I'm an orphan, as Hewell keeps reminding me. But he calls me a bastard. How can I be both a bastard and an orphan? I could have the blood of a peasant, priest, or a warrior. Who knows what I am?" "Never mind that. Your fate is what you make of it. You have a brain inside that head of yours, and you fight well. Here, take this." Hector passed Arthur a spear and picked one up himself. Hector had already wrapped each spear point in rags from dead men's clothes. "We lost men today, good men. We lose more before the summer's over. The prisoner I questioned told of hordes of Saxons. 50 ships landed in Bernicia this spring, commanded by a man named Octa. We must tell King Urian and protect our borders. We must be strong and protect our people, Arthur."
50 ships?
Arthur gasped. Urian kept a captured Saxon warship at one of his western ports, and Arthur had seen it once. Sleek-hulled with a dragon-carved prow, it looked too flimsy to sail across the wild ocean to Britain's east. But the Saxons braved those dangers in increasing numbers, and each ship could carry 60 warriors to Britain's shores.
That's 3,000 warriors.
See, it would have taken me days to work out such a number.
Why do they come here? What's wrong with their own lands?
They think we're weak. Our land is more fertile than theirs. They love war. Who knows? All I know is that we must throw them back.
Bernicia and Deira are lost, as is Kent in the south. That's almost the entire east coast of Britain lost to the Saxons. If we want to stop them, we must kill them. Now, raise your spear. Please, I am tired, and You are tired? Do you think Saxons give a turd if you are tired? They are coming for us, Arthur. They will kill, rape, and burn until everything we have is gone. We are dead, and our lands are theirs. The Saxons are merciless, lad, and so must you be. Ector flashed his weapon forward and cracked the ash stave against Arthur's head. He staggered and then raised his own spear. Arthur shook his head, and Ector hit again, this time striking Arthur in the ribs, and he doubled over in pain. Anger flared in Arthur then, anger at his shame, at his hesitation, at the way men looked at him, at being an orphan, at being alone. He gritted his teeth and attacked, lunging at Ector with the forms he had learned from the old warrior every day since his memories began. Ector parried and ducked and smiled as Arthur's spear almost broke through his guard. The two men danced around each other, and the spear staves sang through the air, twisting, lunging, and parrying with deftness and skill, until Arthur's brow became wet with sweat. Their weapons came together, and Ector's left hand snapped out and grabbed Arthur around the neck, his huge hands strong and rough. "You almost had me there," Ector said, and released his grip. "You have all the skill you need, lad. Just learn to be more savage, more brutal than the men you fight. The spear is not just the blade, it's also the stave. You have your hands, your head, knees, and feet. You have a long knife on your belt and your teeth. Fight like a bear, Arthur. Fight like a wolf, and fight for our people who cannot fight for themselves. Follow the warrior's code as I have taught you, but show no mercy to the enemy, Arthur, for mercy is the dream of weak men who have not seen the face of war. The Saxons hate us with a passion far beyond the rivalry between the kingdoms of Britain. They believe themselves superior, that their gods command them to take our lands from us, and they will show no mercy to a Briton. Hate and rage are powerful, son, but they can also be the betrayers of warriors. The temptation, when fighting led by hate, is to stab, hack, and slash without control. A warrior must use his skill and his mind to remain calm and strike with determined force. A man's life is precious to him, and he will defend it with every scrap of strength in his body. It is not easy to kill a man. When you fight, you must fight to kill, full force. A man I thought I had killed and left lying on the ground once stabbed me in the leg. An enemy will fight like a demon from the unknown underworld to cling on to life, so strike hard and without mercy. Rip them and rend them. You must harden yourself to it, Arthur, or you will surely die in this harsh world. Arthur could not sleep that night, listening to the whimpers of the three women the war band had rescued from the raiders, who wept inconsolably at the horrors they had suffered at the hands of the bandits. Ector's words rattled around his head like mice in a barn wall, of how he must harden himself to the world if he was to take his place within it. Everything Ector had said, Arthur had heard before from Ector, Hewell, and the warriors of Ector's war band on the training ground. But now that Arthur had seen battle, it all seemed more real, more relevant, and more important to remember. The war band rose early that morning, and the three women rode captured horses behind Ector, Kay, and Arthur, whilst the war band marched in a silence, punctured only by the cough or moan from a man suffering from too much ale the night before. The news of the Saxons and their 50 ships quietened them, and the men feared what that new army meant for them and their families, for it meant war, fear, death, and suffering. "Thank you for saving my life," Arthur had said to Luneta the moment she awoke, and a broad smile creased her pretty face. He had helped her up from the broken tiled floor and given her his last oatcake to break her morning fast. As the warriors struck camp and prepared litters for their dead, Arthur had found Kay and congratulated him on his bravery. Arthur marvelled at the dark blue death ring etched on Kay's right forearm,
and his foster brother had grabbed Arthur in a warm embrace. Amends were made, and Arthur rode with the warband back to King Urien's bare fort, with Hector's words burned into his mind like a cattle brand. He had to steel himself to what must be done, had to be ready to kill and strike with his spear, and he promised himself that next time he would strike without hesitation. The warband marched through the forest and hills of Reged, under a pale blue sky the colour of winter ice. The kingdom of Reged sat in the northwest of Britain. Britain contained many kingdoms. To the north was Dal Riata, Gododin, Lothian, and Pictland. To Reged's east were the lost kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira. South of Reged lay Elmet, and then Damnonia, ruled by Uther Pendragon, the king of kings. To the southeast lay Kent and other lands lost to the Saxons, just as Deira and Bernicia were. Finally, the western kingdoms of Gwynedd, Powys, and Gwent. And, finally, Bernicia, ruled by King Morholt and his wild Irishmen, who had conquered that land a generation before Arthur was born. Each kingdom was distinct and fought to protect its borders, its woodlands, its cattle, salt, tin, clay, shale, jet, lead, iron, and copper, from jealous and warlike neighbours. The bare fort stood high and proud atop its promontory, looking down onto the river Eden as the warriors crested a heather-covered hilltop. The bare fort was a timber hall built by King Urien's father, Gunvarch the Cold, perched on a steep-sided hill inside the river Eden's wide meander, which flowed out into the grey sea to the west. Gunvarch was a cunning old dog, and had ordered every man in his kingdom to help build a mound atop the hill and a hall atop the mound. Below the hall and mound, a wooden wall of sharpened timber stakes ringed the hilltop, encircled by a deep ditch. Inside the walls was a wide courtyard with thatched houses and room for blacksmiths, weavers, potters, craft workers, and Urien's courtiers. Many lords of Britain made their homes in the ruins left by the Romans. The neatly dressed stone walls were beyond the ken of any craftsman in the kingdoms born in the fiery wake of the legion's departure. But King Farch built a new fortress, high and impregnable, or so he hoped. Marshland and reeds surrounded it on one side and the river on the other. Pastures and farmland swept away to north and south, and coppiced woodland to the east. The west led to the sea, to trade, fishing, and salt pans. So the bare fort was both a snarling cliff-top fortress and a rich hub for trade, silver, and wealth. Arthur stared at the pointed walls, the vast lofty hall and its thatched roof. The hall appeared to be made of gold, shining in the sunlight, and the walls resembled sharp spears encircling the place, like a hall of an ancient god soaring high in the clouds. Smoke from a dozen fires hazed the hill and sat above the bare fort like its very own cloud. And as the warband marched up the worn path towards the fortress, a horn blared long and loud to announce their arrival. Arthur and Kay secured the horses in a stable by the gate, and just as Arthur emerged from the stink of horse and fouled hay, he found Hywel waiting for him at the stable door. The stocky warrior chuckled as Arthur approached. He had taken a shallow cut to his forehead during the fight, and his brawny forearms were thick with death rings. "I saw you, bastard," Hywel said, his eyes narrowing. "You've a coward's heart inside of you. Hector can't see it, but I can. Might be better for us all if you just left, rode off in the night, and never came back. I don't want you beside me when we face Saxons, boy. Your spear will drop, or you'll run, and our men will die. So piss off when it's dark. Run away. You know you want to." Arthur just carried on walking, pretending that the warrior's words hadn't affected him, even though they sliced into his heart like a sharp blade. "What did he want?" asked Kay as they jogged to catch up with Hector. "Nothing. Ignore him. He's full of piss and wind. He had his eye on Luneta,
and she's only got eyes for you." "What?" said Arthur. "The men talk of it, that Hywel will ask my father for Lunetta's hand. His own wife died in childbirth 2 winters back. Come now, you know Lunetta has loved you since we were boys. Don't play the innocent." Deep down, Arthur knew Lunetta loved him. But it was the love of a child, of a young girl for an older boy, and Arthur was a man now. He liked Lunetta, her wildness and ferocity and her bright eyes, but it was a love for a sister, nothing more. Kay punched Arthur on the shoulder, and Arthur punched him back, but they had thankfully caught up with Hector, who strode towards King Urien's hall, and Arthur could remain silent. The bear fort took its name from a monstrous bear's skull mounted above the hall's wide oak doors. It snarled down at Arthur, bone white with teeth as long as a man's finger. Urien had killed the beast himself when he was Arthur's age, and as he stalked beneath its snarl, Hywel's words continued to sting him like a whip. 2 burly spearmen guarded the door, and they frowned as Arthur and Kay passed between them. A wall of heat hit Arthur as he entered King Urien's great hall. The warmth was like the blast from a furnace, but tinged with the acrid smell of sweat, leather, and iron. The roof was high and smoke-blackened. Torches flickered in iron crutches set high on support posts, which stretched from floor to rafters. Shields with Urien's bare sigil hung on the walls, along with shields of men Urien and his warriors had slain in battle. Warriors filled the place, men wearing hard-baked leather armor, a handful in chain-mail, and all peering over one another for a glimpse of what occurred at King Urien's high seat. Arthur shouldered through the warriors, past men he recognized and others he didn't. Men with braided beards, some with blue-black tattoos on their faces, others with scars and missing teeth. "Why are there so many men here?" said Arthur as he sidled around a broad-shouldered man. "The king must have summoned his warriors whilst we were away," said Kay with a shrug. "It would take over 2 days to bring all the warriors of Rigid together. Even Hector's home at Caer-Ligualid was a half-day ride from the bear fort." Arthur had visited Urien's hall many times, but had rarely seen it so full of fighting men. A fire burned in a stone hearth at the hall's centre, and its smoke escaped through a smoke-hole in the thatch. The fire, combined with so many men, made the hall close and oppressive, and Arthur was glad when he reached the raised dais where Urien sat on his throne and glowered at the throng before him. "Lord King," Hector said. He stood below the king's throne and bowed his head. "Hector has returned," growled the king, his voice deep and as full of gravel as a riverbed. "What news of the raiders?" Urien sat slumped on his throne, a wide and deep chair carved of oak, adorned with the skulls of 5 warriors he had killed during the Great War. Urien was bald, and his braided beard was as grey as an iron spit, but despite his age he exuded power and strength. A scar ran from the top of his head down through his eye to his jaw. He was broad and thick-necked, with a pugnacious round face and clever eyes. As a boy, Arthur had loved to sit by a winter fire and listen to bards talk of mighty Urien, Uther Pendragon, Hector, Cadwallon Longhand, Golois, Ambrosius Aurelianus, and the other heroes who had fought against the evil usurper Vortigern and his Saxon horde. "Bucalari from Bernicia's borderlands, Lord King," said Hector, and a rumble of voices swept across the hall. "A band of masterless men whose heads we mounted on spears, to warn others what happens to those who raid in Rigid." "Good. Perhaps I should have ridden with you. I could do with getting out of this cursed chair for a while. We should not call Bernicia and Aira by their old names any longer, for they are no longer part of our lands, no longer part of what was once Britain. They are Hlogir, the lost lands, lost to pagan Saxons and their axes, shields, and ships. Good land, rich land, all lost. By all the gods, but we must cast these bloody invaders from our shores."
"The raiders were mercenaries forced out of Bernicia by a new force of Saxons, my lord. I questioned one of their number, and he spoke of 50 ships landed this spring. 3,000 Saxon warriors, led by a man named Octa." More murmurs rippled across the hall as men whispered in shock at the huge number of warriors. "There are already thousands of the scum in Bernicia and Aira, or Hrogir, as you say, my lord. They swell Saxon armies to the size we haven't seen since Vortigern first invited the Saxons to our shores. And they do not come in peace, Lord King. There will be war this summer, and it will take all our forces to keep them out of Rigid."
"I know it, Hector. I heard tell of such a force. King Letan Loidok of Gododin sent word days ago, which is why I have called my warriors and comitatuses here to the Bear Fort. I have sent my son Owain ahead with 50 men to scout our borders. We must rally our army and march east to guard our borders. Brigid will fight the Saxon Horsens, and so will Letan. We march to war, my warriors. Red war!"
The men in the hall stamped their feet and roared their approval at the king's command, so that the hall shuddered with the noise.
"They are pagan scum!"
screeched Dustan, Urien's priest. He was a pinch-faced man, with a small mouth and close-set eyes over a sharp nose, so that he looked like a sparrow. He wore a filthy robe, woolen, with a ragged hem and loose sleeves, from which shook his thin white hands.
"Worshippers of foul gods, idolaters, sinners, and the enemies of God. They must be stopped, driven from this land like dogs. God wills it."
His voice grew in pitch until he screamed like a fox. Spittle flew from his mean mouth, and his eyes rolled with pious fury. Urien, like Hector, allowed a Christian priest to live in his hall and to preach to his people, just as he permitted folk to worship the old gods. Both men did so more out of fear of upsetting the nailed god than out of love for him. The warriors reached for the crosses at their necks, or touched charms and the iron at their belts for luck, and to ward off the god fury Dustan invoked. All men feared God, Jesus, the Virgin Mother, and the priests who spoke their word. There were other gods in Britain, old gods spoken of in whispers, or called upon in times of need, childbirth, sickness, or battle. Arthur liked the tales of those violent gods, told by bards and scops, just as much as the tales of kings and warriors. But the word of God and his priests had power, and when Dustan screeched, the warriors echoed his cries for the slaughter of invading pagans. Urien raised a ringed hand, and the hall fell silent. Only the creak of the hall's timbers and the sigh of men's breath disturbed the stillness. Such was Urien's command over his fighting men. Arthur wondered at Urien's words, for he must have heard of this new army of Saxons before he dispatched Hector to deal with the Bucalari raiders, which meant he sent Hector out close to the borderlands where thousands of Saxons massed for war, because he cared little for his champion's life, or because he knew Hector would come back alive with the raiders punished.
"There is a messenger come to speak to you, Lord King," said Urien's steward, a thin man with a crooked nose and a bent back. He wore a finely woven tunic and a green cloak, and waved his hand at a warrior in a helmet and with long moustaches who stood to the side of the high platform.
"Come forward and speak," rumbled Urien.
"King Urien," said the man in a strange accent, "I come to you from your friend King Leodegrance of Cameliard. I have ridden far and crossed the sea, for my king has need of your help."
"Leodegrance," Urien said wistfully.
The king sat back on his throne and smiled, his face creasing in a lattice of wrinkles across his broad skull.
"All men know my brotherhood with your king, of how he sent men across the sea from Cameliard and Amorica in the dark days to help our cause. What can I do for my old friend?"
The warrior bowed deeply in recognition of Urien's respectful words.
There is war across the sea, Lord King. The Saxons continue to march westwards. They flee their homelands, a place of never-ending war, riven with violence since the Romans left so long ago. The Franks march eastwards, and the Saxons' lands are a hell-pit of slaughter and lawlessness. Just as our lands were when the Romans left in my father's grandfather's time, said Urien, and the men in the hall nodded solemnly at the memory of those dark days. We are beset by war, Lord King. Armorica and our once peaceful land are under attack from Saxon pagans and the warriors of Francia. So King Leo de Grance fears for his family's safety and sent his daughter to you for protection, to be fostered by you until a suitable match can be found for her. She is of marrying age and ready for a good husband. I would do anything for Leo de Grance. His daughter is welcome in my hall. He knew you would say that, my lord. Your legend burns as brightly across the sea as it does in your own lands. So my king already sent his daughter to these shores on his fastest ship, guarded by his bravest men. But she has fallen foul of the very men your champion Hector